welcome, first of all, and second, thanks for that kind introduction, and also to the International Arts and Ideas Festival for giving us this space to talk about such an important issue in our society, and particularly how it disproportionately affects young people, particularly young people of color and other marginalized groups. Before I get too far into this topic, I want to talk a little bit about what we do at Rock the Vote and how this kind of came to be of what we'd be talking about at this panel. So, as I was mentioned, Rock the Vote is the largest nonpartisan nonprofit organization getting young people involved in the civic process. We were founded 25 years ago by music executives when no one was really paying attention to young people. The general purpose was to wake young people up to civic engagement, so we flooded what was really the only cultural channel at the time, MTV. Today, we create cultural engagement and that culture by collaborating with top entertainment and creative content creators and putting it out on distribution channels. And today, there are so many distribution channels when you count the internet. We were the first to create an online voter registration tool to increase access to voter registration. Today, it's available in 13 languages and for free to any organization who wants it, which really improves get out the vote efforts. This year to date, we've registered over 400,000 using that tool. We work with national and local groups to leverage our big partnerships, particularly in the media space, to highlight local narratives that are facing young people. We continually build civic technology tools, create content, and make opportunities to coordinate with and empower local groups. This fall, we'll have a bus tour that will span 2 months, and we'll go to several different states all across the country. We'll meet with young people on and off college campuses to turn excitement into meaningful participation. An important piece of what we also do is we poll young people. This year, we're working with USA Today to survey young people and how they feel, gain insights on how they're feeling about the issues and about the election this year. Our January poll revealed that the economy was the top issue for young people. Probably not surprising, education was second. I'm going to give you some other numbers from our latest poll in March, which we dug into both these issues a little bit more. Apologize for all the numbers here, but 68% of young people believe they will be more successful than their parents. 68%. The current reality of this is very different. This is actually the first generation that on average will be worse off than their parents. Another number, 85% of millennials agree they should be able to support themselves and their families based on a 40-hour work week. Can I just take a poll? How many of you work more than 40 hours in your job? Sounds kind of like a dream, right? 71% believe the economy needs more organizations and rules to protect its workers. This was particularly true among millennials of color. Perhaps this is a nod to things like the whistleblower policies and unions, but maybe there's more to that. One reality when it comes to young people in the economy is that unprecedented income disparity we're experiencing. Probably not surprising, this is very much highly correlated with education levels. For this reason, we can't have conversations about the economy without talking about education. On that note, 86% of young people believe continuing education is the way to advance their career. Interestingly, on this note, this was true across all demographics and all employment levels. 86%, let me say that again, 86% of young people believe continuing education is the only way to advance their career. So whether you're fully employed, make more than $50,000 a year, you still believe that you need more education to move upwards. If you're unemployed and broke, same thing. So there's an increasing amount of pressure to be educated, and there's serious competition for upward mobility. The issue being that when we talk about education, we need to be talking about access and the cost. 78% believe American higher education system is broken. 86% agree that most people aren't prepared for the impact of student loan debt. Finally, 83% believe that the government should focus on improving education opportunities for lower income students. This number actually gives me hope. 83% in believing in improving education opportunities for lower income students who are statistically speaking largely going to be of communities of color. While there's certainly work to be done, millennials are the most tolerant and accepting generation in our country's history. This 83% gives me hope that young people believe that when those of us who are struggling are given opportunities, we all benefit. I'm not sure that this is true of all generations before it. It's important to remember that the oldest millennials, the oldest of us, were 27 when the recession began. I think this is lost on a lot of older people. We were just entering adulthood. We, like generations before us, were told if you work hard and get a good education, we'll succeed. So many of us did just that. But just as we were supposed to be making our mark on the world, the recession hit. We couldn't get jobs. Many of us were underemployed or unemployed. We stayed living with our parents or moved back home. We watched our parents who had worked their entire lives working for companies lose their jobs, lose their homes. Some forwent schooling to take jobs to contribute to household income. Those of us who were fortunate to carve out careers became the breadwinners of our family and sent money back home. As the country starts to recover, it's important to remember that the recession had a tremendous impact on the early stages of our careers that have affected education levels, career paths, and salary potentials. That's just the recession. That doesn't take into account all the other societal factors and policies that have created an uncertain future for our young people. Which brings us to why we're talking here today. This past December, in a Harvard Institute of Politics poll, 48% of young people ages 18 to 29 declared the American dream dead. This begs the question of what is the American dream? How do young people view it? Is it dead or has it just changed? How does this impact young people and how are they reacting to this reality? Has our society failed its young people if it really is in fact dead? The incredible thing to think about as we have the discussion today is the enormous amount of power young people have and will continue to have in the coming years, both in the labor force and in the voting population. Those who don't know and haven't been paying attention, the millennial generation is our largest generation in our country's history. It's over 80 million strong. It is also the most diverse generation in our country's history, with over 40% people of color and 15% are foreign-born. In 2012, young people made up just 15% of the voting population. Even though young people still turn out at lower rates than older generations, in 2012, they decided 4 battleground states. That's not to include all of the state, other federal, and local elections that are decided by many fewer votes. In 2016, millennials will make up 30% of eligible voters, double that from 2012. There's an incredible amount of power that they have if they go to the polls. With the economy being the #1 issue for young people, and nearly half of them believing that the American dream is dead, their views on this topic and how the candidates are or are not speaking to young people's concerns are an important topic. That's what brings us here today. The American Dream, 2016, millennials in the presidential election. So today we have an incredible group who will be speaking on the panel. Individuals who have different expertise and experiences, which should really make for a very insightful and thought-provoking discussion. We'll invite you guys up for questions later as well. So let me ask actually if our panelists will come up to the stage, just their mics. So first, we have Abby Kiesa, who's the youth coordinator and researcher at Circle, which is short for Center for Information Research on Civic. Yep, I'm going to try that. The Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Abby's been at Circle for over 10 years. Prior to that, she was at Campus Contact, which works with universities and colleges to improve civic and social responsibility on campuses. Anything you want to say that I missed?
Thanks, Carolyn.
Okay. Austin Belali is the director of the Youth Engagement Fund, which is part of the Democracy Alliance, which is a network of progressive donors. Prior to YEF, Austin was the millennial coordinator at the labor organization SEIU, where he researched young people's relationship to and involvement with unions and employee organizing. Hi.
Hi, everybody. I'm Austin. Are there any fathers in here today?
Good call.
Okay, happy Father's Day. And I can't think of a better way to spend your Father's Day than hearing about how your children and grandchildren are not going to leave home. So we'll see how that goes for you.
Thanks, Austin. So next we have Kelly Osajima, who's the Voter Engagement Manager at Advancing Justice for Asian Americans in LA, an organization that fights for civil rights, provides services, and builds coalitions for the nation's fastest growing but most underserved population, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, with the ultimate goal of creating a more equitable and harmonious society. She's also a recent graduate of UCLA, where she was a student organizer. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Kelly, and I have to confess something. This is the first panel I've ever been on, so I'm just trying to downplay how excited I am to be up here. And I'm 25 years old, so I don't really have the impressive resume of my fellow panelists. But as a millennial, I've experienced firsthand a lot of the issues that we just talked about, and I've experienced the disappointment and disillusionment that comes from trying to engage in a system that doesn't seem to care about me. But I've also seen firsthand the amazing power of student and youth organizing. So yeah, really excited to talk about that. And for me, my personal moment of becoming civically engaged started when I was a student at UCLA. During my second year of college, there was a 32% fee increase that passed, and it increased our tuition by $2,500 just in 1 year. That had a really devastating effect on a lot of my friends who had to take on multiple jobs or had to drop out entirely of school. And so for me, that was the moment when I realized that the political is really personal. And so that's what started my journey of becoming civically engaged and engaging others too. So thanks for having us.
Yeah. So with that, we'll start the discussion. We'll leave probably about a half an hour. We'll try and leave a half an hour for you all to ask questions. But with that, we'll get started. So cool. So first question is the American dream dead? And does it actually matter if it is? Austin, I'm starting with you.
Well, that's a very light question to begin with, so thank you. I think that I wouldn't say the American dream is dead. I would say it's reached its saturation point. And by that I mean that it's beyond the point at which it can be absorbed anymore by the American public. And I think the polling that you talked about lays that out. And the thing about the American dream, and most of you in this room know, is that nation states and peoples, they survive as peoples and nation states when they have stories that hold them together. And in the United States of America, because of our sordid history, the founding story of our country has left many people out. And so the American dream story, which was really told during the Cold War in the 1950s as a way of rallying the entire country in a battle against the Soviet Union. And so the idea that every person, if they work hard, if they play by the rules, if they go to get a good education, they can be anything. That myth almost became a founding myth for the country after World War II. And what we're beginning to see now is that story, again, the post-Soviet era that we live in, there's no antagonist to hold that story together at a time where all these statistics that you mentioned are taking place in the lives of young people. So what does it mean? I think it is both a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. The challenge of it is, in the absence of that story, we're beginning to see a real battle take place. And the battle is about whether or not the story that will replace the story of the American dream and the individuals who can strive for success is going to be a story about traditionalism and holding on to the past identities of family, the past notions of religion, and also of racial identity. So we're seeing that express itself through movements of traditionalism today, close the borders, these kinds of things. And then on the other hand, you're beginning to see upsurges of movements around egalitarianism, pushing for advancing rights. And you can see right now this retelling of America's story and what the new identity will be for the country is playing itself out in the presidential elections. And there's one candidate who's really deeply tied to the story of traditionalism, making America great again, and one that's saying, I'm with her, who's essentially running on knocking down barriers for people to reach opportunity. And so the question for all of us, I think, is when we talk about young people, we know that political events that happen at the age of 18 are 3 times as powerful as events that happen at the age 40. And so this particular election and how the nation begins to answer this question about who we are, who do we mean when we say we the people, it's not just important for young people today. It's going to define generations of young people to come.
Anyone want to go after that?
Well, I've been wrestling with, Austin just mentioned we the people. And, I think that the notion of we the people and democracy is, I think one could argue, is as much of an American dream as there is an economic American dream. And so I've been wrestling with the idea of, is there a second American dream of democracy? And what is, if we're going to talk about the, original American dream, what is civic about it? Is it something that's very individual, or is it something that we collectively bring about? And if it's something that we collectively bring about, how are we doing that? How are we teaching young people in the United States to solve problems so that more people can achieve the American dream? And I think one of the things that we're seeing now that I'd love to talk about is, I think there's an argument to be made that young people are trying to claim space to create the American dream more so than we're helping them do that. And so there's a lot of really amazing examples that I think we're going to talk about where young people are saying, I want to be part of this, and not waiting for people to create something for them, but grabbing it and claiming that space themselves.
So young people are really recreating what American dream is. Does that sound right? Yeah. Kelly, are you seeing with being on the ground with young people, right? Do you see this sort of being played out? Do you see young people sort of making their own definitions of what American dream and success can look like?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I have a lot of friends that are not going into traditional 40-hour work week type of one stable job. Feels like I have a lot of friends that are making their own way, and they're becoming SAT tutors, or they're teaching music for students, or just figuring out ways to use their own gifts and their talents, and being very entrepreneurial about how they're going out and finding success that way for them. So I'm seeing that a lot. Because it's hard. It's really hard for us to find a stable job that is going to meet all of our needs. My roommate is also one of my really good friends from high school, and she went to UCLA with me. And I was really lucky when I was at school because my parents were able to help cover tuition, but she has $100,000 in student loan debt just from undergrad. And she is interested in running for political office someday, so she is working as a field representative for a assembly member in the California state legislature. So it's it's a respectable job, but she's making less than $40,000 a year from that, and she's working so many hours, and between paying student loan debt, between paying for loans and her car payments and rent and groceries and living expenses, being a human, how is she going to save money to buy a house? How is she going to support a family that way? It's not even an option, and I think that's what a lot of us are experiencing.
I think this goes back to something we actually talked about last night of what are we defining as successful now, right? And what do we see what are the differences between this generation and previous generations about like where are our priorities and specifically in terms of when we're talking about the economy and what we're spending money on, right? Like big things like home purchases, right? I think that was something, Abby, you were talking about yesterday of like looking at some interesting data on that.
Well, some interesting data from Fusion. Fusion tried to replicate, the media company tried to replicate a poll that was done in 1986 to try to understand what are the differences between what young people then thought about the American dream and what young people now think about the American dream. And there's differences, you know. Now, young people think that the American dream includes being able to pay for college, whereas that wasn't as much in the top 3 kind of things that young people in the mid-'80s thought was a core part of the American dream. It was for them to pay for their kids to go to college, but now it's paying for both your kids and for yourself to go to college. So I think that there's, you know, young people are having to make some really big trade-offs when it comes to, you know, what they prioritize in their life.
You know, one of the things I think a lot about is I remember growing up and hearing the stories of my grandparents in unions and seeing the bumper stickers on their cars that talked about, you know, the union won the 8-hour workday, all those kinds of things. The unions won the weekend. And what will the bumper sticker look like for our generation, you know, 20, 30 years from now? And when I think about it, the biggest opportunity and the greatest need when you talk about the stresses of your friend are particularly amongst young women. Because if you look at 1979, I just saw a report recently that in 1979, you know, women were working 2 times less hours per week in terms of paid work. And they're working 2 times more now of paid labor and work. At the same time, women today are still responsible for over 2/3 of all the child care and the elderly care in the household. So women are taking on this enormous new role in society and really moving our economy, because the fastest growing sectors of our economy are service sectors where women are the predominant workforce. And that we still have this gap in terms of caretaking and caregiving. And so I think this moment really calls for us to reimagine not just the role of individual young people struggling against the system, but what does a new social contract look like that's written more from the perspective and vantage point of women who in the 20th century maybe weren't, well, not maybe, they weren't in the forefront of really creating an architecture for that. And I think what it does to the notion of success is that our notions of success historically are very much so defined by the hunter who goes out, the father who's the breadwinner who brings back, right? That's what success is. But what happens to this country when taking care of others becomes the way by which we measure success? And when I saw an article, for example, about President Obama, that one of his great accomplishments was being a president who spent a lot of time with his 2 daughters. And what does it mean when men, young men, begin to learn that success is actually taking responsibility for caring for my parents, caring for children, caring for the community around me? I think that's going to be pretty transformative for the country.
So one of the things a few of us got together last night and we were talking about this idea of the 40-hour work week, because it seems so far from what any of us do. Probably all of that you do as well. And sort of who spearheaded that, I was honored to speak last week in Detroit on jobs in the economy. And Ford was actually who came up with the 40-hour work week, or he was essentially the first to institute it, which then led to the Fair Labor Act about a decade later. And his reasoning was sort of twofold. One, there would be more spending locally, right, which would help the local economy on consumer products so that his workers could purchase cars and other things in the area. But the second was so that his employees would have a good home life. And it was not entirely altruistic. They would have a good home life and therefore be more loyal to the company, which I think is really interesting when you think about millennials. The average millennial changes a job every 3 years. And as they become an increasing part of the labor force and have different values, right? Things like spending time with family, having flexibility. Most of them would rather choose a job that impacts makes an impact, and that's a very big thing for them when they choose a job. What are the how much weight do you think they'll have in changing sort of what our employers are doing, and how much force will they have in the labor movement? Whoever wants to take it.
Well, so before I came to the Youth Engagement Fund, I was at the Service Employees International Union, and I built their Millennial program. And I have some knowledge and experience with this, but I think one of the big questions is, over the last 50 years, most of the progress in this country has been in the social arena. We've seen women really advance their rights. We've seen African Americans and communities of color advance their rights, LGBTQ communities advance their rights, at the same time that there's been this concentration of wealth and massive inequality. And I think that's some of the backstory around the candidacy of Trump and the decline in life expectancies we were just talking about amongst many working class, white, middle-aged folks. And so we began to see employers taking the sides of folks who are struggling for people's rights. So for example, when they passed these LGBTQ discrimination bills in different states or proposed them, you saw companies like Coca-Cola in Georgia saying, heck no, we're going to shut down if you pass that. And so I think to me, in my mind, whether or not millennials are really seen by employers as partners in reshaping industry is the extent to which the actions that public actions that companies are taking against discrimination and for people's rights would transfer into a more inclusive economy. Because millennials, again, they're the most diverse generation of all time, right? Mm-hmm. And because of the demographic shifts, I think it now calls the question when you talk about workplace issues, those are often the issues of women, of communities of color, et cetera. And employers are really struggling with how do we move away from a top-down structure of decision-making and open our doors to the more horizontal forms of engagement that millennials are doing online. What does that then look like in reshaping how companies run? And if there's people in here in the private sector, that's a conversation that you may want to be having as well, because that's where I think the workforce is headed.
It's so interesting that you bring that up, because I was literally, when I called my father this morning, talking to him about, I took the opportunity to ask him about his formative moment in his life, and coincidentally, he brought up a couple of work examples. Speaking of which, my dad might be watching online, so hi, Dad. And he brought up this example of having some real formative work experiences with a manager and a company that really helped shape the way that he looked at his life and what he would, and how he led his life. And I think that one of the things that is really important, kind of building on that, is also understanding that not everyone has the same outlook, the same goals, and the same experiences. And we've talked about how diverse in terms of race and ethnicity the millennial generation is, but oh my goodness, the number of factors in which the millennial generation are a diverse generation are exponential in so many ways. I mean, we have young people who are struggling just for basic dignity. And we have young people who are trying to start a new tech business that's multi-million dollars. There's just a vast range of diversities amongst the generation. And so as part of a conversation, especially about the economy and about what people want their life to be like and their goals, what they make meaning from, is we absolutely have to talk about the fact that not everyone's the same, and not everyone wants exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kelly, you have any thoughts?
You covered it all.
Yeah. So I think, one of the questions I think I want to get into is, are we seeing the candidates actually honor all of the experiences, right? These diverse experiences that young people have. Are we seeing them talk about the issues that are concerning young people? And on top of that, are there candidates who are doing it better than others? Would be my next. Kelly, you want?
Yeah, sure. I'll start it off. Well, I think it's impossible to talk about millennials and their engagement with presidential candidates without recognizing, what Bernie Sanders' campaign has done to draw just unprecedented amounts of energy and support from young people. I know right here in Connecticut, I think I have the numbers actually from a Circle report. Thank you very much. The estimated youth turnout matched the previous record set in 2008, 12%, the total population. But the number of young people who cast their ballot increased, as did the youth share of all voters, from 10% in 2008 to 12%. And this participation was driven mostly by young Democratic primary voters. And does anyone know how much they voted in favor of Senator Sanders versus Secretary Clinton? Can anyone throw out a number? 70, 40? Yeah, actually it was 83% to 17%. So he has this like overwhelming amount of support from young people. And if you had thought of this democratic socialist old white guy coming from Vermont, who is just this independent in Congress a year ago, compared to what he's built primarily with the support of and energy and enthusiasm of young people, it's like you wouldn't have ever thought that would have been possible. But I think that largely why he is resonating so much with young people is because he's speaking directly to these issues that we're facing. He's recognizing that incremental change doesn't work for us, because the issues we're facing are too big to be solved through small changes within a political system that doesn't seem to. That's a really nice ringtone. It's very lovely. But the political system that doesn't seem to represent or really care about what we're facing. Primarily he is the first candidate that's saying out loud what young people feel about our political system, being so dependent and so responsive to big money and to big donors. And he's the first one to kind of like name that and to say, our system is no longer working for us. It's working for corporate interests and for billionaires that have the money to finance their campaigns. And so, his recognition that we need to get money out of politics, that we need to start this political revolution to bring more people into the process and elect progressives across the map that are going to help to change this and bring us forward is something that my generation is resonating with. $15 an hour minimum wage nationwide, fighting climate change with bold solutions, making higher education tuition free. These are all things that that really address and get to the heart of the problems that we're facing. So it's kind of cool because he's not this like young charismatic leader. He's not enlisting the help of all these fancy celebrities to talk to us, but like young people are resonating because he's actually talking about issues. And at the end of the day, that's what we care about is issues. So yeah, just it's important for presidential campaigns moving forward. I know there's going to be a lot of maybe disillusionment and disengagement from young people coming out of the primary, but I think it's important moving forward for the candidates to not just outreach and speak to young people, but really to listen to us and to our concerns, and to make a commitment to putting our issues and our needs at the forefront, and not just as lip service, actually prioritizing us. So I think that what Secretary Clinton also has to do is really commit to making the democratic process for electing representatives more democratic. I'm sure everyone was really following what was going on in the primary, but for me it was really a shock as one of the first elections that I've really been engaged in, and just seeing that normal citizens that are casting a vote may not be able to make much of a difference because of the superdelegate system, and because we have closed primaries in many states on the Democratic side, so a lot of no-party preference voters, which a lot are actually young people, aren't even able to vote in those. And in California, where I'm from, we have we have an open primary, so if you don't have a political party, you can still vote for the Democratic candidate, but you have to request like a special crossover ballot, and most people have no idea that that's a thing, so then more people are left out of the process. And so, I think there's so much anger and there's a lot of disappointment that came out of this really very closed off system. So moving forward, it's important for us. If the Democratic Party wants to bring more young people in, they have to be committed to an open, inclusive system.
And that's a wonderful example of how and whether and how our civic and political systems are actually built to bring people into the process. And I think that there are many different arguments for the fact that it may not be. And voting and that confusing process that you just used for the primary in California is just one example, right? Connecticut is actually an interesting state because y'all passed some really important civic education standards recently that really move forward and are much more modern than some other states, using the C3, which the National Council for the Social Studies passed, which is really exciting because one of the things that the C3 does is develop skills, right? And so it takes away this sort of textbook, doing worksheets and just reading about history notion of civics, and moves it into something that is inquiry-based and has an action component. So people are learning the skills of what it means to be part of a democracy and to be part of a group of people who are trying to solve problems. And that's one of the things that I think, we have trouble sort of doing that as a country, sort of welcoming people into that process in a way that brings them in and it's not intimidating, right? I think that might be an experience for people of many ages, but particularly young people who are new to the system and may not be habitual voters or know that you have to go to a website and print out a ballot first or request a ballot.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we find, and Circle has done a lot of research on this too, is young people, and it's not that they don't vote because they're young, it's because they're new. They're new voters. And the process is very overwhelming, or seemingly so, right? Even if it's not in their state. And each state and each jurisdiction has different laws about it. And part of the challenge is actually educating on this, because first is registration, second is educating them not only on what they're going to be voting on and who they're going to be voting for, but also what they actually need to vote. Which is an intense process as well, and what their rights are, because not everyone who administers an election actually knows what they're doing is the reality, and may not have the best intentions either. So I think transitioning. I think there are a couple things that you talked about. One that I want to bring it back to is I'm actually quoting you from an earlier conversation about. Young people have a lot of thoughts on the issues, and they are increasingly speaking up, and they are leading all of the movements that are happening. And yet there is this tendency for particularly the media to reduce what we are talking about to whining of spoiled kids, right? And not seeing us as having very serious issues and opinions about these things. And what is it our responsibility to make candidates speak to us, or is it the responsibility of candidates? And should they know this is going to be a huge voting block, should they be speaking to us proactively? Abby.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You just he had a face, so I thought maybe that meant you had something to say.
So I think that, right, so I work at a research center. And so I'm trying to speak from the perspective of the data that we have, the empirical data. And one of the really important pieces of that for us is providing research and data on what's actually happening with young people. And so when it comes to elections, what we actually find ourselves doing is trying to dispel myths, which is, a fun thing to do sometimes, but also can be really frustrating. And I'm hoping that Austin will talk about his interest in trying to change the narrative, because we are often in the place of trying to change the narrative about young people and specifically young voters, because there really is a myth out there that young people don't participate in elections. There's some data from this spring that half of millennials pay attention to the national news, and that 60% were paying close or very close attention to the presidential election. And so I think that we really need to change the way that the news media has this sort of chip on their shoulder about young people and millennials, because some of these things are just flat out not true, and they may also not be productive. And this is one of the research questions that I have, which is, what effect does seeing negative news about millennials in the media do to millennials? That I'm really interested in sort of testing, because I think that the potential is that it could be really negative if you see, there's all sorts of research about that in other ways. And this election cycle is actually a really interesting example, because contrary to previous primaries, we've had both parties have extended primary and caucus processes, and in this cycle, we've seen almost as much Republican youth participation as on the Democratic side. So we've seen this participation this year break records from 2008 from both parties, but especially among young people who identify with or sort of lean towards Republicans. And so, we care about all young people participating, so that's really important for us to see and to be able to talk about. And it's also, important for both parties to be committed to developing, because parties are so significant to our political process, it's important for both parties to actually see, and as Kelly was saying, actually talk with youth. And so that's one of the things that we're absolutely going to be paying attention to in terms of what the presidential campaigns are doing and what down-ballot campaigns are doing, what congressional campaigns are doing, what local campaigns are doing. And if you in the audience are working on campaigns, how can we make that suggestion to candidates that they actually meet with young people, with youth groups in the community? There was an amazing panel last weekend of youth activists here in Connecticut, and I'm sure that they would love to talk to local candidates about, issues that they care about. So I think that this idea that Kelly brought up about speaking with young people is absolutely core to some of the issues that we're talking about.
Yeah. I think one of the big barriers that people can help with is making it safe for young people to disagree with authority and with each other. Because in our culture in the United States, we have a culture that says anything that we discuss that's political is somehow partisan, and that to talk politics is dangerous. And one example of that is over Thanksgiving. I remember watching TV, and the news hosts, they were joking and saying, okay, at the Thanksgiving table, make sure you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about who's fat and who's not, and you don't talk about politics. And so if young people can't discuss politics at the dinner table, they can't discuss it in schools because teachers are terrified that they'll face a backlash or funding cuts if they talk about politics. And the media only talks about politics as a horse race between candidates and not about choices about whether we're going to have an egalitarian direction and narrative of the country or a traditionalist. Where in the world will young people talk about politics? And with donors, this is a very important conversation. People who are concerned about the destiny of our country and they want to put their money in shaping that future. Is the research shows there's actually a study in the Stanford Social Science Social Innovation Review. They did a study of what works and what doesn't work in voting. And it turns out that mobilization of voters, like you're seeing now with the media and people going knocking doors, has a very small percentage impact on who actually comes out and votes. And secondarily to that, making it easier to vote. You saw different states like Oregon pass automatic voter registration. Those things matter, but they make it easier for people who would have voted already to vote. And so what actually has the largest impact in terms of increasing the amount of voters in the country, what the social science shows us, it's creating a year-round political life that young people live. That politics isn't something that happens in an election. Politics is the conversations you have at the dinner table. They're the discussions you have in the classroom. it surrounds us. And if you've been to other countries, this happens all the time, where you sit down and young people will know more about U.S. politics than kids in the United States know. And not just who's running for office, but what are the issues, what are the choices that have to be made about the future of the country. And so I think we have to make this distinction between discussing politics being partisan, right, and creating safe spaces for us to disagree with each other in a way that's not disagreeable and break into violence. And I think in the absence of that, we can expect, yes, young people are active, they're interested, but to channel that into year-round engagement, we're going to face a lot of challenges doing that.
I know one of the things that I think older generations comment on a lot and see is that we're very engaged on social media, right? Exactly. And you can see if you go to anyone's Facebook page who's young, there's likely going to be an article about whether or not it's directly related to politics. It is about an issue that is they're passionate about, right? And how do we turn that into meaningful participation, right? Beyond. And so I think that the one positive is, yes, there is like this culture, this like place where people can have a conversation on social media maybe. But how do we, even if we register at record numbers, how do we make sure these people, how do we make sure young people actually turn out to vote in this election? Anyone have any thoughts on how to?
I have too many, so.
Yeah, right? I know, where do we even start? I think that the perception of government that young people have is that government is not an effective avenue to creating change. So we're engaged in issues, we care about these things that are affecting us, but we don't see government as the place that is gonna, we participate in is gonna solve these issues. And so I think, what we have to do is reach out, like we were talking about, not just on election day, not just to vote for candidates, but to engage young people in the political process year round, and to show us how government can be used as a way for change to be made in our lives. And so there are a couple ways to do that. The first thing that we can do is we can establish like youth representatives in different offices and state legislative offices and congressional offices and city council, and this actually assigns someone to interface with young people and to bring young people into the decision-making process when it happens, so we can see and we can actually participate in that process. Something else we can do, and something that California is doing, is introducing a bill to lower the voting age in local school board elections to 16. And that's something that high school students have been like really, really excited about.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it's actually going to be an initiative, hopefully on the 2018 ballot in California, and it's going to be like totally youth-led by high school students that are really motivated by the idea of them having like an actual say in elections. Other thing that we can do, I was an unpaid intern back in the day in college for a Congress member. We can introduce pay for interns. I think that would be a great thing to get more young people involved in government. What other things we can do? I have like a whole bunch of notes on this question because I was really excited to answer it. And also change the system around who gets elected. I think that's going to be very important. So, for example, getting money out of politics. And that right now, our representatives are a lot older and a lot whiter than who's actually in the population, and young people just don't see themselves as being represented in our government. Encouraging young people to vote for office by removing barriers to run for office and making it easier, and introducing publicly funded elections. I think those are all really great ways to engage us. In terms of actually getting us to vote in 2016 in this election, something that is happening in the past couple of years is that a lot of like campaign like data systems are becoming like more sophisticated and analyzing like who are like our voters that vote like in every election, and just like targeting those voters and saying, okay, so if you voted in like 4 out of the past 5 elections, then we're going to call you, like we're going to send mail to you, we're going to knock on your door. And so that means that if you're a new voter, if you're a young person, then you're not going to get outreach to by these candidate campaigns. And so I think that's really important for these campaigns to actually make an effort to target low propensity voters. And that's something that my organization does. What I do is I run a Get Out the Vote project before every election cycle in Asian American Pacific Islander communities, and we actually specifically target low propensity and new voters, new and young voters, and we actually call in 10 different languages, and we have that personal contact that says, this is why you should vote, this is what's on the ballot, this is how you can go to the polls. And a lot of the young people for this past primary didn't even realize that there's an election happening. So there's a lot of information and education that needs to be done by the candidates. But also, I think peer-to-peer organizing is something that has been seen as like consistently really, really valuable way of getting youth to vote. It wasn't, I don't think it was Senator Sanders' campaign staff that were responsible for the large numbers of youth voter turnout. It was the fact that these young people took it upon themselves. They were inspired by his message, so they went and held discussions with their friends, and they took to Reddit, and they got together and made canvassing apps, and it was that peer-to-peer organizing that really drove the youth turnout in the primary. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Go ahead. I have a follow-up. Well, it's in this general space, so you might answer to it as well. Can we keep the conversation to get young people to turn out? Can we keep it positive and uplifting to create action and turnout? Or do we need to illustrate sort of the consequences of what could happen if they don't turn out this election?
Well, so Austin was talking about, I think implicit in what Austin and Kelly are talking about is both in terms of this specific election and in terms of year-round engagement is the idea of building a culture of engagement. And one of the things that is really critical to that are, some of the things that Kelly mentioned, things like youth participatory budgeting. Massachusetts is testing out a cool new thing that Oregon's been doing for a while called Citizens Initiative Reviews, which is a way to get young people and people of other ages involved in making local decisions that affect their lives. And so I think that another way that we can do that, we're in a museum right now, and part of the things that we can use is we can leverage the civic institutions that we have to have these conversations that Austin is talking about issues that affect young people's lives, between generations, and set an example that this is what we do in a democracy instead of shying away from it.
Yeah, and because of my role, we don't directly coordinate with campaigns or candidates, so I'm always cautious about how I talk about what the messaging should be. But I will say that from a civil society lens and what the role of the media and these kinds of things, I think it is important to have a message that is facing the realities of what young people are going through today. But I do think it is important to be aspirational about the future. And it's not necessarily just a question about turnout in the presidential year, but it's about a larger story of what is the role of government in the lives of the American people. And there's so much cynicism about government in the country right now, because oftentimes, particularly in communities of color, the only experience people have with government are law enforcement officers, either through ICE and deportation raids, or African Americans who are afraid of the police in that sense. And so I think an aspirational message is key to turnout, because why would people vote for people in government if they think government is an evil entity, although that has motivated some people. But I think it's also a question for the 2018 midterm elections, because we know that young people will show up in presidential years to vote, but they don't show up in the midterm elections. And so telling the right story now, a positive, uplifting message of solidarity, I think is what we can be doing in civil society. It also begins to lay the train tracks for engagement post-election, to say, look what you were able to do by coming out, even if your candidate of choice didn't win. Your voice mattered, and now there's so much work left to do. And we continue to engage them going into the midterms, where, as everybody in this room knows, 2020 is the year of the census. It's also the last election that matters for redistricting. And so there's a lot at stake. There's going to be legislators across the country who will be elected. So the rest of this century, the 21st century, the first 20 years of the century are going to define those, the remaining 80 years of the century. And so I think this question about what the message is, how we're talking to them, is actually a quite critical question to think about.
And there are plenty of examples of how young people have affected politics at the national level and at the local level. I mean, and this is another, kind of myth that we dispel, which is, I think that the media often says, oh, young people don't turn out at high numbers, but 2008 was a high. It did go down slightly nationally in 2012, and in some states there's a different story, especially between states where there are competitive statewide elections and presidential battleground states. But young people swayed the presidential election in 2012. I mean, in 2008, it was huge. And then this year, we saw young people in Cleveland and in Chicago and a few other places impact really significant elections. And young people have affected the conversation of the presidential election this year in such a huge way. Yeah. So I think that I think we can keep it positive by pointing to examples. It doesn't take, absolutely skyrocketing youth turnout for young people to affect elections. And one of the things that we did was build a statistical index this year to say, and here are the places where young people are disproportionately likely to, and they're really important places, districts, really significant states.
So I just want to thank all the panelists, because they all said yes when we asked them, and they're amazing, as you can tell. So, and thank you all for coming also to such an important discussion. So.